My name is Nia. I am 32 years old and somehow still healing from the wounds my family inflicted. I inherited my grandfather's $10,000 mountain house, while my sister and brother inherited a $1 billion company and a luxury mansion. I thought my inheritance was only about repairs and memories. But while renovating that rotting wood cabin, I discovered a secret room no one ever mentioned. What I found inside that room gave me the power to destroy the people who tried to ruin my life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent neighborhood meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house, with its manicured lawn and expensive cars, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. From elementary school through high school, I maintained perfect grades and stayed out of trouble. I went on to become a meticulous historical archivist, dedicating my life to preserving the truth. But none of that mattered to my mother, Vivian. She was a woman who valued appearances, status, and money above all else. She idolized my older brother Jamal and my younger sister Maya. They were her golden children. They shared her lighter complexion and her ruthless ambition. I took after my late father. I had his darker skin and his quiet, observant nature. In my mother's elite social circles of wealthy African American families, she viewed my dark complexion and my modest career as an absolute embarrassment. The true depth of her cruelty became undeniably clear on a freezing Tuesday morning inside a cold, mahogany-lined law office in downtown Atlanta. We were gathered for the reading of my grandfather Thomas's will. Grandfather Thomas was a self-made man who built a logistics and transportation empire from nothing. He was the only person in the family who ever showed me genuine love. Sitting in that stiff leather chair, I felt the crushing weight of his absence. The room smelled of expensive cologne and old paper. My mother, Vivian, sat across from me, dressed in immaculate designer couture, looking more like she was attending a gala than mourning her father-in-law. Beside her sat Jamal, who was 36 and already acting like the arrogant chief executive officer of the family empire. On her other side was my 28-year-old sister Maya. Maya was a spoiled social media influencer who spent her days unboxing luxury handbags for her followers. Her husband Darren sat next to her. Darren was 30 years old and served as the chief financial officer of grandfather's company. He was a ruthless and calculating man who only cared about his own advancement. Before the lawyer even opened his folder, my mother leaned forward and looked me up and down with obvious disdain. "You know, Nia," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you really could have made an effort today. That dusty archivist job of yours is completely ruining your skin. You look so ashy and tired. Grandfather always knew you liked cheap, dusty things. I suppose your presence here is just a formality." I kept my face perfectly blank and stared back at her. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. Jamal chuckled, adjusting his expensive silk tie. Maya rolled her eyes and checked her phone, completely bored by the proceedings. Darren just smirked, tapping his expensive pen against the heavy wooden table. The lawyer cleared his throat, demanding our attention. He adjusted his glasses and broke the seal on the final testament of Grandfather Thomas. The silence in the room was heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew Grandfather was worth billions, but seeing how the assets would be divided was the ultimate prize for my greedy family. The lawyer read the distribution of assets in a monotone voice. Jamal was officially handed the controlling shares of the billion-dollar logistics empire, making him the undisputed king of the company. Jamal smiled widely, leaning back in his chair like he had just conquered the world. Maya was gifted the $15 million luxury estate in the wealthiest district of the city. She actually squealed and clapped her hands together, leaning over to kiss Darren on the cheek. Then the lawyer looked down at his papers and let out a small sigh. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a rusty metal ring holding 2 tarnished brass keys. He slid the keys across the long mahogany table toward me. For Nia, he read aloud, "You receive the deed and the keys to the mountain cabin located in the Blue Ridge Mountains, valued at approximately $10,000. The room erupted into laughter. Darren laughed the loudest, his voice booming off the wood-paneled walls. $10,000, Darren mocked, wiping a tear of amusement from his eye. A rotting cabin in the middle of nowhere. That is perfectly fitting for a librarian who collects garbage for a living. Enjoy the mold and the termite infestations, Nia. Maybe you can archive the dead bugs. Maya giggled, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. Vivian smiled a cold, victorious smile. She looked at me as if I was a peasant who had wandered into her palace. Grandfather always knew you belonged in the dirt, Nia, she said smoothly. It is exactly what you deserve. I reached out and took the rusty keys. The metal was cold against my palm. I did not say a word. I knew Grandfather Thomas better than any of them. He was a brilliant strategic man who never did anything without a profound reason. If he gave me a worthless cabin, he had a purpose. I slipped the keys into my pocket and stood up to leave. I wanted nothing more than to get out of that toxic room and grieve for my grandfather in peace. But my family was not finished with me. As I turned toward the door, Darren pulled a crisp white envelope from his tailored jacket and tossed it onto the table. Not so fast, Nia, Darren said, his voice losing all its amusement and turning sharp and cruel. Before you go back to your pathetic life, there is one more piece of business to handle. I stopped and looked back at the envelope. What is that? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Vivian stood up, smoothing her designer skirt. As you know, she said, looking down her nose at me, your grandfather was personally funding the medical care for your former nanny at that expensive assisted living facility. That woman was nothing but a glorified babysitter who filled your head with nonsense when you were a child. Since Jamal is now in charge of the family finances, we have reviewed the corporate accounts. We are officially cutting off all medical funding for her immediately. The facility has been notified. The outstanding balance is now entirely your responsibility. The air left my lungs. My beloved nanny, the woman who had actually raised me and loved me when Vivian refused to hold me, was suffering from a severe illness. Her medical bills were astronomical. Grandfather had promised to take care of her forever. You cannot do this, I said, my voice finally breaking. She needs that care to survive. You have billions of dollars now. This is a death sentence for her. Jamal stood up and buttoned his jacket. It is a business decision, he said coldly. We are trimming the fat. If you care about her so much, you can pay for it with your archivist's salary. Oh, wait, you cannot. I suggest you move her into a public facility before the end of the week. Darren stepped closer to me, his eyes full of malice. You have always been a burden, Nia. You refused to play the game, you refused to respect your mother, and you embarrassed us with your mediocre life. This is what happens when you bite the hands that feed you. You get nothing. I looked at the four of them standing together. They looked like a pack of wolves circling their prey. They wanted me to break down. They wanted me to beg. I swallowed the thick lump of grief and rage in my throat. I picked up my bag and walked out the door without another word. I could hear their triumphant laughter echoing down the hallway as the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me. The sky outside was dark and threatening. A torrential rainstorm had moved over the city, matching the absolute devastation I felt inside. I got into my old sedan and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I had to figure out how to save the woman who raised me. I had to find a way to pay those massive medical bills. I drove through the heavy rain toward my rented apartment in the city. The traffic was terrible and the windshield wipers could barely keep up with the downpour. I just wanted to go home, curl up in my bed, and formulate a plan. But when I finally turned onto my street, my heart stopped completely. Through the gray sheets of rain, I saw a pile of items dumped unceremoniously onto the wet sidewalk. As I pulled closer, I recognized my favorite reading chair. I saw my books soaked and ruined in the puddles. I saw my clothes, my kitchenware, and the small framed photographs I cherished all thrown into the street like garbage. Two large men in raincoats were tossing the last of my boxes out the front door of my apartment building. I slammed the car into park and ran out into the pouring rain. "What are you doing?" I screamed, running up to the men. "This is my property. You cannot do this. I pay my rent." One of the men, a burly guy with a clipboard, looked at me with zero sympathy. "Are you Nia?" he asked. "Yes," I said desperately, trying to rescue a box of my delicate archival tools from a deep puddle. The man handed me a laminated piece of paper. "You have been evicted," he stated bluntly. "The building was purchased 3 days ago by a new management company. The new owner invoked an immediate termination clause for your unit. You have to take your things and leave the property immediately, or I am calling the police for trespassing." I stared at the eviction notice. At the very top, the name of the new management company was printed in bold black letters. It was a subsidiary owned entirely by my brother Jamal. He had bought the building 3 days ago, just before the will reading. He had planned this eviction perfectly. He wanted me to return from the law office where I had just been humiliated and stripped of my inheritance to find myself completely homeless. He wanted to punish me for not showing proper gratitude to my mother at the funeral. He wanted to break my spirit and leave me in the gutter. I stood in the freezing rainwater, soaking through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. I looked down at my ruined books and my waterlogged possessions. Any normal person would have collapsed right there on the pavement and surrendered to the despair. But I am not a normal person. My father gave me his dark skin, but he also gave me his unbreakable resolve. I refused to shed a single tear for the people who did this to me. I moved with cold mechanical precision. I opened the trunk of my car and began packing whatever I could salvage. I loaded my essential documents, my clothes that were not completely ruined, and my basic necessities into the back seat. I left the ruined furniture behind. The rain beat down on my back, but I did not stop until my car was full. I got into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I turned on the heater and sat shivering in the driver's seat. I was entirely alone. I had no home, no money to pay the medical bills, and a family that wanted to see me destroyed. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the rusty ring of keys. The $10,000 mountain dump was the only property I owned in the world. I put my car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving my old life washed away in the storm. I headed toward the highway, pointing my car toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. I did not know how I was going to survive, but I knew I had to keep moving forward. I drove straight into the heart of the storm, ready to face whatever was waiting for me in the mountains. The drive up the Blue Ridge Mountains was treacherous. As I gained elevation, the heavy rain shifted into freezing mist. My sedan struggled against the steep incline until I turned onto an unpaved driveway hidden behind overgrown pine trees. My headlights cut through the fog, illuminating my inheritance. The $10,000 cabin looked exactly like what it was priced at. It was a decaying structure with a sagging roof and a porch ready to collapse. I parked, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the biting mountain air. Approaching the porch, my flashlight caught something wrong. The front door was completely shattered. Splinters of wood littered the porch and the deadbolt hung uselessly from a busted hinge. I picked up a piece of firewood and cautiously pushed the broken door open. The interior was a disaster zone. The sparse furniture had been slashed and overturned. Couch cushions were gutted, their stuffing scattered across the rotting floorboards. Bookshelves had been pulled away from the walls, and old books lay with broken spines. Even the floorboards had been pried up with a crowbar. Someone had been here very recently. This was a systematic, targeted search. They had ripped this place apart looking for something specific. Jamal and Vivian must have sent someone ahead of me, hoping to find whatever Grandfather Thomas might have hidden away. They wanted to make sure I got nothing but an empty shell. Any normal person would have called the police, but I knew local authorities would take hours to arrive and do absolutely nothing. Instead, my professional archivist instincts took over. I lowered the piece of firewood. I was trained to find order in chaos. I spent my days restoring historical documents and piecing together shattered histories. This cabin was just another project. I returned to my car and retrieved heavy-duty trash bags, archival gloves, and a battery-powered lantern. I walked inside, set the lantern on a sturdy wooden table, and went to work. I separated ruined furniture from salvageable items. I stacked torn books into neat piles, assessing the damage to their bindings. I swept the stuffing and shattered glass into the trash bags. Sifting through a pile of debris near the overturned bookshelf, my gloved hands brushed against a thick roll of heavy parchment. It had been wedged behind the bottom shelf, escaping the violent search. I unrolled it carefully, flattening the edges on the table under the lantern light. They were the original architectural blueprints of the cabin, dated over 40 years ago. Grandfather Thomas had drawn them himself. Before I could examine the blueprints closely, my cell phone vibrated violently in my pocket. The sudden noise made me jump. I pulled it out and saw my sister Maya requesting a video call. I stared at the screen. I knew I should ignore it, but I needed to know what they were planning. I swiped accept and held the phone up. Maya's flawless face filled the screen. She was lounging on a massive white leather sofa wearing a silk robe. The background was dazzling. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows showing a panoramic view of the city skyline. She was inside her new $15 million inheritance. "Look who finally got reception," Maya purred, taking a sip from a crystal champagne flute. "I just wanted to check on you, big sister. How is the luxury mountain retreat? Is the roof leaking on your head yet?" I kept my expression entirely neutral. "The cabin is fine, Maya. What do you want?" "I just thought you might want a tour of my new estate," she said, spinning her phone around to show off a massive indoor swimming pool. "It is exhausting having so much space, honestly." She walked the phone into a sprawling modern kitchen where Darren was standing at a marble island. He was holding a jeweler loop up to his eye. Spread out across the island were dozens of velvet boxes. I recognized them instantly. They contained Grandfather Thomas's prized vintage watch collection. He had spent his entire life curating those watches. Each one held a specific memory of a personal victory. "Say hello to the eviction queen," Darren shouted without looking up. "What are you doing with his watches?" I asked, my voice hardening despite my effort to remain calm. Darren chuckled, picking up a diamond-encrusted watch. "We are selling the whole lot. I found a luxury yacht listed for sale in Miami, and these old dusty things will cover the down payment perfectly." Maya flipped the camera back to her face, grinning maliciously. "You see, Nia? The adults are handling the real money now. You just stay up there in the woods. Try not to freeze to death. Oh, and enjoy the mold." She laughed loudly and ended the call. The screen went black, leaving me in the dim light of the lantern. My hands were shaking. They were going to liquidate everything my grandfather had built to fund their superficial lifestyles. They were going to erase his legacy. I put the phone away and turned my attention back to the blueprints. I ran my finger over the faded blue ink, tracing the lines and measurements Grandfather Thomas had drawn. As I studied the layout of the main floor, my spatial assessment skills flared. Something was glaringly wrong. The blueprint indicated a living room depth of 20 feet from the front door to the back wall. I grabbed a tape measure from my tool bag. I walked to the front door and extended the tape across the floorboards, walking backward. I hit the solid back wall and looked at the tape. It read exactly 14 feet. I rechecked the tape. 14 feet. I walked outside onto the muddy porch and measured the exterior foundation wall along the side of the house. The exterior measured over 20 feet. I walked back inside and stood in the center of the room looking at the solid wood-paneled back wall. The math did not add up. The interior living room wall was structurally 2 meters shorter than the exterior foundation. There was an unaccounted block of space behind that wooden wall, roughly 6 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The intruders had torn up the floorboards, but they had not bothered to measure the dimensions of the cabin. They had completely missed the structural anomaly. I walked slowly toward the back wall, covered in dark, knotty pinewood panels from floor to ceiling. In the exact center hung a heavy vintage portrait of Grandfather Thomas. It was an oil painting showing him in his younger days standing proudly in front of his very first delivery truck. The intruders had knocked over everything else, but this painting remained perfectly straight. I grabbed the sides of the heavy gilded frame, intending to lift it off the wall. I pulled upward, but the painting did not budge. I pulled harder, applying all my strength, but it was completely immobilized. It was not hanging on a nail or a wire. The frame was physically bolted through the wood paneling into the structural studs behind it. I stepped closer, bringing the lantern up to illuminate the edges of the frame. I ran my bare hands along the thick, ornate molding, feeling every groove and curve. I traced my fingers down the side to the bottom right corner. My index finger brushed against a small metallic irregularity hidden deep within the carved wooden flowers. It was a tiny lever flush against the wood. I pressed my thumb against it and pushed upward. A loud mechanical click echoed through the silent cabin. The sound was sharp and heavy, like a vault unlocking. Suddenly, the entire wall began to vibrate. The wood paneling groaned deeply as hidden gears shifted behind the pine boards. I took a step back as the section of the wall holding the portrait slowly slid backward into the darkness, and then tracked smoothly to the left, sliding on an industrial rail system completely concealed within the floor. A rush of cool, dry air spilled out from the newly revealed opening, cutting through the damp mustiness of the cabin. I raised my lantern and aimed the beam into the gap. Behind the fake wooden panel stood a massive, heavy-duty steel door. It was a commercial-grade fireproof vault door, painted a dull industrial gray. There was no keyhole and no traditional handle. Instead, mounted in the center was a sleek digital keypad and a biometric thumbprint scanner. My breath caught in my throat. I stood alone, staring at a high-tech vault door that belonged in a Federal Reserve building. The intruders had destroyed a $10,000 dump looking for scraps, but they had walked right past $1 million secret. Grandfather Thomas had hidden his true legacy right here, and I was the only person in the entire world who had skills to find it. I reached my hand toward the heavy fireproof steel door. The biometric scanner pulsed with a faint blue light. Grandfather Thomas was a man who left nothing to chance. If he had built this hidden fortress specifically for me, he would have ensured my access. I pressed my right thumb against the glowing glass panel. For a second, the machine processed the print. A sharp mechanical chime echoed off the rotting walls of the cabin, followed by the heavy thud of deadbolts retracting. I grabbed the edge of the thick steel and pulled. The heavy door swung open on perfectly oiled hinges, silent and smooth. I stepped over the threshold and crossed from a decaying $10,000 cabin into an architectural marvel. The air inside hit my face immediately. It was cool, crisp, and completely devoid of the damp, moldy smell that permeated the rest of the structure. I was standing in a climate-controlled state of the art bunker. The walls were lined with reinforced concrete painted a sterile white. Recessed LED lighting flared to life, automatically illuminating the space with bright, clinical precision. My eyes scanned the room, expecting to find stacks of cash, hidden gold bars, or perhaps the missing vintage watch collection that Maya and Darren were currently pawning off. But there was no physical wealth stored here. The room was strictly functional. In the left corner stood an independent, off-the-grid server tower. Its black casing hummed with quiet power green and blue lights blinking rapidly across its network switches. The floor beneath it featured heavy-duty battery banks and an inverter system likely fed by concealed solar panels on the roof or a buried generator. Grandfather had essentially built a ghost network entirely severed from the logistics empire headquarters. In the center of the room, resting on a reinforced steel pedestal, sat a heavy biometric safe. It was a massive cube of dark tungsten steel, lacking any handles or hinges. The front panel featured a digital display screen and a numerical keypad alongside a secondary retinal scanner. This safe was the heart of the bunker. I approached it, my archival instincts heightening my focus. I touched the screen and a prompt appeared demanding an 8-digit override code. I stared at the blinking cursor. Grandfather Thomas and I shared a language built entirely on history. While my mother Vivian paraded Jamal and Maya in front of society cameras, my grandfather used to sit with me in his leather armchair going over dusty ledgers and historical texts. He taught me that history was not just a record of the past, but a map of human behavior. I knew he would not use a simple birthday or an anniversary. He would use a date that held profound significance for both of us. My mind raced back to my teenage years. I remembered a specific afternoon when I helped him restore the very first shipping manifest his father had ever signed. We spent hours cleaning the brittle paper and preserving it under archival glass. It was the document that started the entire family legacy before the billion-dollar empire ever existed. He had looked at me that day and told me that a true legacy is built on truth, not greed. The date stamped at the top of that fragile manifest was September 18, 1924. I hovered my trembling fingers over the keypad. I typed 0918-1924. The digital display flashed green. A heavy internal locking mechanism released with a satisfying clank. The thick tungsten door popped open a fraction of an inch. I pulled it back to reveal the contents. The interior was completely empty save for two distinct items: a thick leather-bound ledger and a rugged encrypted external hard drive. I reached in and pulled out the ledger. The leather was worn soft from being handled repeatedly. I opened the cover and recognized my grandfather's meticulous, precise handwriting. He had used a fountain pen, the ink a stark jet black against the thick archival paper. As a historical archivist, I spent my days analyzing records, verifying authenticity, and unearthing buried truths. It took me less than 2 pages to realize exactly what I was holding. This ledger was explosive. It was a master document of financial ruin. My eyes darted across the columns and rows, absorbing the sheer scale of the betrayal. The pages contained meticulously recorded proof that Vivian, Jamal, and Darren had been embezzling millions of dollars from the family logistics empire for the past 5 years. Grandfather Thomas had tracked every single stolen dime. The entries detailed a highly sophisticated web of corporate fraud. Darren, in his role as chief financial officer, had been manipulating the quarterly tax documents, inflating operational losses in the shipping division to hide massive cash withdrawals. Jamal, using his executive authority, had authorized phantom shipments and fabricated vendor contracts, paying millions to logistics suppliers that did not actually exist. I turned the page and my breath caught. My mother, Vivian, was implicated in the worst betrayal of all. The ledger showed she had been quietly bleeding the employee pension funds, funneling the stolen money through a series of complex offshore accounts based in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. These shell companies were untraceable by standard audits, but grandfather had painstakingly tracked the routing numbers directly back to Vivian's personal luxury portfolios. They had been stealing from the company, stealing from the employees, and stealing from grandfather right under his nose. And grandfather Thomas knew everything. He had watched his own daughter-in-law and his precious golden grandchildren dismantle his life's work out of pure, unadulterated greed. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of awe. Grandfather had not confronted them because he knew they would simply destroy the evidence and tie him up in endless legal battles. Instead, he played the long game. He let them think they were outsmarting him. He let them think he was just an old man losing his grip on his empire. He gathered the evidence, quietly building this bunker, securing the server, and handwriting the ledger to ensure it could never be hacked or erased. He did not leave me this mountain cabin as a final insult. He left me the weapon to destroy their corruption. He entrusted me with the ledger and the hard drive because I was the only person in the family who possessed the integrity to expose them. I was the archivist. He knew I would protect the truth no matter the cost. I closed the heavy leather cover, holding the ledger tightly against my chest. I reached into the safe and grabbed the rugged hard drive, slipping both items securely into the deep interior pocket of my coat. I had the proof. I had the power to strip Jamal of his CEO title, to send Darren to federal prison, and to tear down Vivian's entire elite social standing. As the profound realization of my absolute power settled over me, a piercing electronic shriek shattered the quiet hum of the bunker. I jumped, spinning around to face the server tower. A control panel mounted on the concrete wall adjacent to the servers was flashing a brilliant warning red. The motion sensors on the cabin's exterior perimeter had just been triggered. I rushed over to the control panel. A small, high-definition security monitor flickered to life, displaying night vision feeds from hidden cameras mounted in the pine trees outside. The heavy rain was still pouring down in sheets, but the camera feed was crystal clear. Two sets of glaring headlights flashed through the darkness, cutting across the muddy, unpaved driveway. The beams of light swept across the shattered front door of the cabin and illuminated the broken debris on the porch. Two heavy-duty pickup trucks slithered to a halt, their massive tires crunching loudly against the gravel and mud. My stomach dropped. I leaned closer to the monitor. 4 large men stepped out of the vehicles, pulling their raincoats tight against the torrential downpour. I recognized the burly man in the lead instantly. He was the same man Darren had hired to throw my belongings onto the street earlier today. Darren's hired men had returned. They had not found what they were looking for during their first violent sweep of the property. Darren must have realized that Grandfather Thomas would never leave an asset completely unaccounted for. He sent them back to finish tearing the cabin apart, to rip up every floorboard and tear down every wall until there was nothing left but dust. Through the audio feed on the monitor, I could hear their heavy boots stomping onto the wooden porch. One of them kicked a piece of the ruined sofa out of his way. They were armed with heavy iron crowbars and high-powered tactical flashlights. The lead thug gestured toward the back of the cabin, his flashlight beam sweeping violently across the dark interior, right toward the knotty pine wall that concealed the bunker. I was entirely trapped. If they found the open steel door, they would find me. If they found me with the ledger and the hard drive, I would never make it off this mountain alive. Darren would ensure I disappeared, and the evidence would burn with the cabin. I had to move faster than they did. I had to protect my grandfather's legacy at all costs. I heard the heavy thud of a crowbar striking the wood paneling just outside the vault. Darren's men were tearing down the portrait. I had seconds. My eyes darted around the clinical white walls of the bunker. Grandfather Thomas was a master strategist. He built logistics routes across the country. He would never design a bunker with only one exit. I scanned the ceiling and the corners until my flashlight beam caught a large industrial ventilation grate bolted near the floor behind the server tower. I rushed over and dropped to my knees. The bolts were large and designed to be turned by hand from the inside. I gripped the cold metal, twisting with all my strength. The first bolt gave way with a screech. The second followed. Outside the bunker, the men were shouting. I heard the distinct whine of a heavy-duty power saw cutting into the metal hinges of the exterior paneling. I pulled the metal grate free and set it silently on the concrete floor. The shaft behind it was narrow and pitch black, but I could feel the sharp sting of freezing rain blowing through it. It was an escape hatch leading straight out to the rocky incline behind the cabin. I grabbed my waterproof coat, zipping it tightly to my chin. I shoved the heavy leather ledger and the encrypted hard drive deep into the internal pockets, pressing them flat against my ribs. They were my only leverage. They were my life. I dove headfirst into the narrow steel shaft just as the bunker door shuttered. A massive impact echoed behind me. Darren's men were taking a sledgehammer to the biometric lock. I crawled furiously, my elbows and knees scraping against the cold, galvanized steel. The shaft angled upward, tight and suffocating. The air grew colder and wetter with every inch I moved. I pushed forward, driven by pure adrenaline. I reached the end of the shaft and shoved the exterior weather grate open. I tumbled out into the freezing mud and dense underbrush, landing hard on my shoulder. The torrential rain was blinding. The wind howled through the towering pine trees, masking the sound of my ragged breathing. I scrambled to my feet and looked back at the cabin. Tactical flashlight beams were slicing through the broken windows. I heard a muffled shout from inside. They had breached the bunker. They knew I had been there. I turned my back on the cabin and plunged into the treacherous mountain woods. The terrain was incredibly steep and covered in slick, wet leaves and jagged rocks. Darren's men would be looking for me. They would sweep the main access road and the modern hiking trails. But I had a distinct advantage. I was an archivist. Years ago, Grandfather Thomas used to bring me to these mountains to study the history of the region. He taught me the old Appalachian smuggling routes. These were forgotten paths carved out by moonshiners and early settlers over a century ago. They did not exist on any modern GPS or topographical map. I navigated strictly by memory and instinct, using the natural rock formations and the ancient twisted oak trees as my guideposts. I scrambled up the slick embankment, my hands slipping in the freezing mud. Behind me, I saw the distinct blue-white beams of high-powered flashlights sweeping through the trees. They were fanning out. I dropped low to the ground, crawling beneath a thick canopy of wild rhododendrons. I held my breath as a beam of light passed less than 20 feet away. Heavy boots crunched on the wet foliage. "She has to be out here," one of the men yelled, his voice carrying over the wind. "Check the tree line. If Darren finds out we lost her, he will end us." I waited until the light swept past before pushing myself up and moving deeper into the absolute darkness of the historical trail. I hiked for what felt like hours, my muscles burning and my lungs screaming for air. The freezing rain soaked through my clothes, but the ledger and the hard drive remained safe and dry against my chest. I followed the hidden ridgeline until the terrain finally leveled out, bringing me to a deserted logging road 2 miles below the cabin. I had parked my car far away from the main entrance out of sheer habit. It was a paranoid choice that had just saved my life. I slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors and gasping for air. I did not turn on the headlights. I put the car in drive and rolled slowly down the dark logging road, relying only on the ambient moonlight filtering through the storm clouds. Once I hit the paved state highway, I slammed my foot on the gas. I drove through the night, the storm raging outside my windshield. The adrenaline that had fueled my escape began to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. My hands gripped the steering wheel, trembling slightly. My own mother and brother had left me homeless. My brother-in-law had sent armed men to hunt me down in the woods. I was entirely alone, carrying evidence that could topple a billion-dollar empire. I could not go to the police. Darren practically owned half the judges and politicians in the state. If I walked into a precinct with this ledger, the evidence would disappear into an evidence locker, and I would be arrested for theft, or worse. I needed an ally. I needed a shark. I needed someone who understood corporate law and federal injunctions better than anyone else in the city. There was only one person in the world I trusted with my life: Calvin Harris. Calvin was a high-powered corporate attorney at one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms. He was brilliant, ruthless in the courtroom, and devastatingly handsome. He was also my secret boyfriend of 2 years. We had kept our relationship strictly off the radar because I knew Vivian would try to ruin it. She would have viewed him as a pawn to be manipulated or a threat to be eliminated. Calvin was my sanctuary away from the toxicity of my family. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Atlanta skyline when I finally pulled into the secure underground parking garage of Calvin's luxury high-rise condo. I bypassed the main lobby using my private access fob and took the elevator directly to the penthouse level. I stood outside his door, shivering in my damp clothes, my hair plastered to my face. I knocked firmly. A moment later, the heavy door swung open. Calvin stood there wearing dark silk sleepwear, holding a cup of coffee. His eyes widened in absolute shock when he saw me standing in the hallway, looking like I had just crawled out of a war zone. "Nia," he said, dropping his coffee mug onto a side table and rushing forward. "What happened to you? Are you hurt?" I stepped into the warm entryway of his apartment and collapsed against his chest. "I am okay," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "But I need your help, Calvin. They are coming after me." He wrapped his arms tightly around me, pulling me inside and locking the deadbolt. He guided me to his expensive leather sofa and draped a thick cashmere blanket over my shivering shoulders. He rushed to the kitchen and brought me a mug of hot tea. "Drink this," he said, his voice full of gentle concern. "Tell me exactly what is going on." I took a sip of the scalding tea, letting the warmth spread through my freezing body. I reached into my coat and pulled out the heavy leather ledger and the encrypted hard drive, setting them onto his glass coffee table. I poured out the entire story. I told him about the insulting will, reading the immediate eviction, the secret bunker in the mountain cabin, and the armed men Darren had sent to kill me. I opened the ledger and showed him the meticulous handwritten entries. I pointed out the offshore accounts, the phantom shipping companies, and the direct evidence of Vivian draining the employee pension funds. "They have been stealing millions, Calvin," I said, looking into his eyes. "Grandfather Thomas tracked every single cent. This is the proof. We can take them down." Calvin paged through the ledger, his expression transforming from shock to absolute horror. He ran his hand over his jaw, staring at the astronomical figures written in my grandfather's precise script. "This is unbelievable, Nia," he muttered, shaking his head. "I knew Darren was aggressive, but this is federal racketeering. This is massive corporate fraud. They are going to spend the rest of their lives in prison." "Can we stop them?" I asked, desperation bleeding into my voice. "Can we freeze the accounts before Jamal liquidates the company?" Calvin looked up from the ledger and met my gaze with fierce determination. He reached out and pulled me into another tight embrace, resting his chin against the top of my head. "I have got you, Nia," he promised, his voice low and soothing. "You are safe now. I am going to draft an immediate federal injunction. I will take this straight to a federal judge I know personally. We will freeze Darren and Jamal's assets before noon today. They will not be able to move a single dime. The relief that washed over me was intoxicating. I leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid, reassuring beat of his heart. For the first time in 24 hours, I felt safe. I was no longer fighting this war alone. I had Calvin, and he was going to protect me. "You need to sleep," he said, pulling away gently and brushing a damp strand of hair from my forehead. "You are exhausted. I will take these documents into my home office and start drafting the legal filings right now. Go lie down in my room. When you wake up, this nightmare will be over." I nodded, too tired to argue. I stood up on trembling legs and made my way into his massive master bedroom. I did not even bother changing my clothes. I collapsed onto the king-sized bed, burying my face in his pillows. The adrenaline completely drained from my system, leaving me paralyzed with exhaustion. I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me, trusting that Calvin was standing guard. When I woke up, the room was bright. Harsh afternoon sunlight was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat up abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest. I had slept for hours. The apartment was completely silent. There was no sound of typing from the home office. No television playing in the living room. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness. "Calvin," I called out, throwing the heavy duvet off my legs. No one answered. I walked out into the living room. The glass coffee table was completely bare. My waterproof coat lay draped over the sofa exactly where I had left it. I rushed over and patted the internal pockets. They were completely flat. The heavy leather ledger was gone. The encrypted hard drive was gone. Panic seized my throat. I ran to his home office. The door was wide open and the desk was perfectly clean. Calvin's laptop was missing. His briefcase was gone. I sprinted back to the living room and grabbed my cell phone from the side table. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely unlock the screen. I opened a location tracking application on my phone. Calvin and I shared our locations with each other for safety reasons whenever we traveled for work. It was a habit we started a year ago. The application loaded slowly, the map zooming into the downtown Atlanta grid. A small blue dot appeared, indicating my location in Calvin's penthouse. A moment later, a blinking red dot materialized, representing Calvin's phone. I stared at the screen, the blood freezing in my veins. The red dot was not at a federal courthouse. It was not at a police precinct or his law firm. The location tracker was pinging directly from the executive floor of the corporate headquarters of Wilson Logistics. It was pinging directly from the very center of my family's billion-dollar empire. Calvin had not gone to a judge. He had gone straight to the people who were trying to destroy me. The ultimate betrayal crashed over me, suffocating and absolute. I was completely unarmed, the evidence was stolen, and the only man I trusted had just handed my life over to the wolves. The drive from Calvin's luxury high-rise to the glittering glass and steel tower of Wilson Logistics took exactly 14 minutes. My hands gripped the steering wheel with a force that made my joints ache. The red dot on my phone screen remained perfectly stationary, mocking me from the dashboard. Every traffic light, every rain-slicked intersection felt like an eternity. The man I had loved, the man who had held me just hours ago and promised to protect me, had delivered my grandfather's legacy directly into the hands of the enemy. I pulled into the visitor parking structure, my tires screeching against the wet concrete. I did not bother straightening my damp clothes or brushing the tangled hair from my face. I was running on pure adrenaline and absolute rage. The main lobby of Wilson Logistics was a monument to wealth. Grandfather Thomas had designed it to be welcoming, but Vivian and Jamal had recently remodeled it into a sterile, intimidating fortress of white marble and brushed steel. Two security guards stood behind a massive reception desk. I recognized one of them. A man named Marcus, who had worked for my grandfather for a decade. He stepped forward, holding up a hand. "Miss Nia, you are not authorized to be here," he said, his voice laced with genuine regret. "Mr. Jamal issued a building-wide memo this morning. You are restricted from the premises." I did not stop walking. I locked eyes with him and kept my pace steady. "Marcus." I am going up to the executive floor, I stated, my voice carrying a quiet, dangerous authority. You can either try to physically tackle the granddaughter of the man who hired you, or you can look the other way. Marcus hesitated. In that split second of indecision, I bypassed the security turnstiles. I moved straight for the private executive elevator. I knew the security system better than anyone because grandfather had helped design it. I punched in a master override code he had shared with me years ago, a code Jamal and Darren were too arrogant to realize still existed. The heavy steel doors slid open. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator shot upward, my stomach dropping with the rapid ascent, but my resolve hardening into solid ice. The executive floor was eerily quiet. Thick, plush carpets absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I bypassed the empty receptionist desks and headed straight for the corner office. Darren's office. The double doors were made of solid oak and frosted glass. I did not knock. I raised my foot and kicked the center where the two doors met with every ounce of strength I had left. The heavy doors flew open, crashing violently against the interior walls. The scene inside the office burned itself into my memory permanently. Darren was leaning against the edge of his massive mahogany desk, wearing a smug, self-satisfied grin. My mother, Vivian, was seated in a leather armchair sipping espresso from a delicate porcelain cup. And standing right between them, dressed in his perfectly tailored suit, was Calvin. He was in the middle of shaking Darren's hand. The heavy leather ledger, Grandfather Thomas's handwritten record of their crimes, was sitting casually on Darren's desk, like a hunting trophy. Beside it rested the rugged encrypted hard drive. No one jumped when the doors crashed open. They simply turned to look at me. There was no guilt in Calvin's eyes. There was no shame. He looked entirely comfortable standing shoulder to shoulder with the wolves. "Well, look who finally decided to join the real world," Vivian said, her voice dripping with venomous delight. She carefully placed her espresso cup onto a coaster and crossed her legs. "You really are a stubborn creature, Nia. Did you honestly think you could outsmart us? Did you actually believe you could waltz into a ruined cabin, steal company property, and bring down this family?" I ignored her, looking directly at the man I had trusted with my life. "Calvin," I whispered, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Why?" Calvin let go of Darren's hand and slipped his hands into his pockets. He let out a small, patronizing sigh. He looked at me not with affection or regret, but with utter pity. "It was a business decision, Nia," he said smoothly, without a single tremor of remorse. "You live in a fantasy world. You spend your days archiving dead history and dreaming about justice, but justice does not pay the bills. Leverage pays the bills, power pays the bills." Vivian laughed, a sharp, elegant sound that echoed in the large office. She stood up and walked slowly toward me, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Do not look so surprised, little girl," she taunted. "You have always been naive. Did you really think you could keep a secret from me? I knew about your little romance with this ambitious lawyer months ago. I also knew that a man like Calvin is driven by success, not sentiment." She reached out and patted Calvin lightly on the shoulder. "When Jamal and Darren realized you might have found something at that wretched cabin, I simply made a phone call. I offered Calvin the position of head of legal for the entire Wilson Logistics empire. I threw in a corner office, a full partnership track, and a 7-figure signing bonus. All he had to do was secure the evidence and bring it directly to us. He made the smart choice. He chose the winning side." I stared at Calvin, the betrayal slicing through my chest like a physical blade. 2 years. 2 years of shared secrets, late-night conversations, and promises of a future together. It was all a lie. He had sold me out for a corner office and a paycheck. His kiss in the apartment was nothing but a traitor's kiss, meant to lower my defenses while he robbed me blind. "You are a coward," I told him, my voice dropping to a low, steady register. Calvin sneered, his handsome face twisting into something ugly and cruel. "I am a realist," he shot back, stepping closer. "Look at yourself, Nia. You are a broke, naive dropout who could never survive in the real corporate world. You have no money, no power, and no leverage. You thought you could walk in here and play the hero. You were nothing but a stepping stone for my career. You handed me the exact leverage I needed to secure my future. I suggest you go back to whatever dusty library will have you because you do not belong in this arena." Darren chuckled, pushing himself off the edge of the desk. He picked up the rugged encrypted hard drive, tossing it casually in the air and catching it. "It is almost sad," he mocked. The old man went through all that trouble to hide his little secrets. He built a bunker. He wrote a diary. He really thought he could stop progress. Darren let the hard drive slip from his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a heavy thud. He raised his foot and brought the heel of his custom Italian leather shoe down with brutal force. The thick plastic casing cracked loudly. He stomped again and again, grinding the device into pieces. The sound of snapping plastic and crunching metal filled the room as he obliterated the physical components, destroying the evidence right in front of my eyes. "Oops," Darren said, kicking the shattered remnants across the floor toward my feet. "Looks like your digital backup just had a catastrophic failure. And as for the ledger, well, we have a paper shredder and a fire pit at the estate that will handle that perfectly." Vivian stepped directly into my personal space. I could smell her expensive floral perfume. She looked down at me with eyes as cold as absolute zero. "This game is over, Nia," she pronounced, her voice echoing with absolute authority. "You have lost. You have no home. You have no money. The nanny you care so much about will be thrown into a state facility by the end of the week. You have no evidence and you have no allies." She pointed a manicured finger toward the open doors. "You are officially erased from the family tree. You are a ghost. You will leave this building right now and you will never return. If I ever see your face near this company again, if you ever attempt to contact me, Jamal, Maya, or Darren, I will have you arrested for corporate espionage and trespassing. Calvin here will personally ensure you spend the next decade rotting in a federal prison. Now get out of my sight." I stood in the center of the sprawling corner office, entirely surrounded by the people who had sold me out. I looked at Darren's mocking grin. I looked at Vivian's triumphant glare. I looked at Calvin, the man who had betrayed me, now watching me with icy indifference. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had taken away my only weapon and left me defenseless. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to give them exactly what they wanted to see. I let my shoulders slump forward. I allowed my breathing to turn shallow and ragged. I lowered my head, letting my damp hair fall forward to shadow my face, hiding the fierce, calculating fire that was currently burning in my eyes. I made myself look small, defeated, and utterly crushed. I did not scream. I did not curse at them or vow revenge. I did not shed a single tear. I turned around slowly, my movements heavy and lethargic. I walked out of Darren's corner office in absolute, complete silence. I walked back down the plush carpeted hallway, stepping into the executive elevator without looking back. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, walked past the security desk, and pushed through the revolving glass doors out into the pouring Atlanta rain. I let them believe they had won. I let them believe they held all the power. I let them believe I was just a naive archivist who had been outsmarted by corporate sharks. But as I walked to my car, the illusion of my defeat was absolute. They had no idea what was actually coming for them. I merged onto the interstate, leaving the gleaming glass towers of Atlanta far behind me. The torrential rain had finally reduced to a steady drizzle as I drove 2 hours north, crossing county lines until I reached a sleepy small town nestled in the base of the Appalachian foothills. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a retro 24-hour diner. The flickering neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a sharp red glow over the wet pavement. I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming loudly. The place was nearly empty, save for a tired waitress wiping down the counter and an old man reading a newspaper in the corner booth. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth by the window, ordered a black coffee, and pulled my laptop from my waterproof bag. As the screen flared to life, illuminating my face, a fierce, calculating smile spread across my lips. Darren, Vivian, and Jamal thought they had won. They thought they had utterly crushed me, stripping me of my inheritance and destroying the only evidence of their massive corporate fraud. Calvin thought he had played the ultimate game of chess, trading my trust for a corner office and a 7-figure signing bonus. They had all made one fatal miscalculation. They completely misunderstood what an archivist actually does. They believed my job was simply to dust off old books, categorize mundane paperwork, and organize historical files in a damp basement. They did not realize that a master archivist is a highly trained specialist in data preservation, digital authentication, and historical forgery. I spend my entire life identifying fakes, protecting delicate truths from decay, and ensuring that history cannot be rewritten by those in power. I knew exactly how to preserve an original document. And more importantly, I knew exactly how to manufacture a flawless, irresistible decoy. Calvin was a brilliant lawyer, but I always knew his ambition was a massive liability. Over our 2-year relationship, I had watched him navigate corporate bloodbaths with a ruthless hunger that bordered on obsession. I cared for him, but my professional instincts never allowed me to be blind to his true nature. When I escaped the mountain cabin with Grandfather Thomas's handwritten ledger and the encrypted hard drive, I knew I was carrying a massive target on my back. I needed a sanctuary to catch my breath, but I also needed a fail-safe. Before I ever knocked on Calvin's penthouse door at dawn, I made a crucial, highly calculated stop. I visited a secure automated private bank vault in downtown Atlanta, a facility I had used for years to store fragile, high-value historical documents for my private clients. I locked the genuine leather-bound ledger and the true master hard drive safely inside a titanium safety deposit box. The items I brought to Calvin's apartment, the ones I laid out on his glass coffee table with tears streaming down my face, were meticulously crafted fakes. The ledger was a convincing visual replica, containing just enough genuine-looking logistical data to convince a panicked corporate lawyer who was skimming the pages in a rush. The hard drive was a standard external shell carefully weighted to feel authentic. But it was not empty. I had loaded it with a highly specialized aggressive Trojan virus I had coded myself. It was based on archival data recovery tools initially designed to breach restricted mainframes and force corrupted files to surface. Darren was an arrogant man who liked to gloat, but he was not an idiot. He was the chief financial officer of a billion-dollar logistics empire. He would never destroy a piece of critical physical evidence without verifying its digital contents first to ensure he was actually destroying the right files. I knew his paranoia would get the best of him. I knew that before he threw that drive on the marble floor and crushed it beneath his designer shoe, he had plugged it into his computer. He had connected it directly to the highly secure executive network of Wilson Logistics to verify his victory. The moment the USB interface made contact, my trap snapped shut. My laptop screen blinked, signaling a successful remote network connection. The Trojan virus had executed flawlessly. It was completely silent, leaving no trace on Darren's local operating system or his antivirus software. It immediately bypassed their enterprise firewalls, digging deep into the root directories of the corporate servers. It initiated a massive automated data dump. The virus hijacked the company's internal email servers, silently packaging every single falsified, corrupted tax record, phantom vendor contract, and offshore routing number Darren and Vivian had tried to hide over the last 5 years. Within seconds, it blasted those heavily encrypted files directly to the fraud division of the Internal Revenue Service, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the financial crime units of 3 different federal agencies. The payload was delivered irrevocably. Darren crushing the physical decoy drive in his office was nothing but an act of meaningless theatrical garbage. He had essentially locked the doors to the burning building while standing inside it holding the match. A devastating federal audit was now absolutely guaranteed. Their entire corporate empire was about to be ripped apart by federal investigators, and they would not even know it was happening until the agents walked through their glass revolving doors. I took a slow sip of the bitter diner coffee, letting the caffeine sharpen my focus. The fake evidence had triggered the trap perfectly, but the real work was just beginning. I accessed a secure remote server where I had uploaded a heavily encrypted backup of the true master drive before locking it in the bank vault. I bypassed my own complex security protocols and opened Grandfather Thomas's original digital files. The true digital ledger was a magnificent labyrinth of corporate structuring. Grandfather had spent years tracking his family's betrayal, mapping out the exact flow of the stolen millions. But as I scrolled past the offshore accounts and the manipulated pension funds, I realized there was a secondary directory hidden deep within the drive's architecture. It was heavily partitioned away from the embezzlement records, protected by a completely separate layer of biometric and numerical encryption. I ran a rapid decryption sequence utilizing the exact same historical date combination that had unlocked the safe in the mountain bunker. September 18, 1924. The progress bar loaded rapidly, stripping away the dense security walls until the hidden directory finally blossomed onto my screen. It was a vast collection of highly sensitive legal documents, property deeds, zoning applications, and complex logistical routing maps. I opened the first file, and my eyes widened in absolute shock. It was the original deed to the rotting mountain cabin I had inherited. But the legal documentation attached to it told a completely different story than the insulting narrative presented at the formal will reading. The cabin was not just a worthless $10,000 piece of decaying property. The land it sat on encompassed over 5,000 acres of pristine, untouched mountain territory, stretching across 3 different county lines and bleeding into prime developmental zones. Those very same historical Appalachian smuggling trails I had used to escape Darren's men earlier that night belonged entirely to me, and it was not registered in my grandfather's personal name. It was registered to a highly shielded corporate shell company named Blue Ridge, LLC. I pulled up the complex corporate filings for Blue Ridge, LLC. The company was entirely privately held, heavily insulated from outside audits, with only one listed executive director holding absolute controlling power: me. Grandfather Thomas had secretly transferred total ownership of the massive corporation to my name 3 years ago, legally binding it so securely that Vivian, Jamal, and Darren could never contest it in court. But why? Why hide 5,000 acres of rugged mountain terrain behind a corporate shell company? I dug deeper into the directory, opening the logistical routing maps and topographical surveys. Grandfather was a visionary pioneer of the shipping industry. He saw pathways, connections, and supply chain routes where others only saw insurmountable obstacles. I cross-referenced his detailed maps with current federal infrastructure projects and massive highway developments pending approval in Washington. The absolute truth hit me with the force of a runaway freight train. The land surrounding the cabin, the 5,000 acres wholly owned by Blue Ridge LLC, was the exact geographical choke point for a massive upcoming interstate expansion project. The federal government had been desperately trying to acquire that specific corridor for over a decade to build a centralized inland shipping port. It was a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure initiative designed to completely revolutionize freight transport across the entire eastern seaboard. Vivian, Jamal, and Darren thought they had inherited the beating core of the Wilson logistics empire. They thought the vast warehouses, the fleets of trucks, and the existing corporate contracts were the true wealth of the family. They were completely and utterly wrong. The existing company was a dying dinosaur slowly bleeding out from their own internal corruption and short-sighted greed. Grandfather Thomas had purchased the Blue Ridge Corridor, silently knowing it was the ultimate key to the future of the logistics industry. Whoever controlled that specific stretch of land controlled the new federal shipping routes. Whoever controlled those routes would hold a total unbreakable monopoly over national freight distribution for the next century. He had not just left me a decaying cabin in the woods. He had left me the bedrock foundation of a brand new empire. An empire easily worth 10 times what Vivian and Jamal were currently tearing each other apart over. He handed them the sinking ship and quietly handed me the master keys to the future. I stared at the glowing laptop screen, the sheer magnitude of his absolute genius washing over me. He knew his children and grandchildren were hopelessly poisoned by greed. He knew they would aggressively tear each other apart, fighting for the rotting scraps of his old company. He orchestrated the entire inheritance structure to keep them permanently distracted. He used the cabin as a brilliant master misdirection, making it look so pathetic and worthless that their arrogance would ensure they never bothered to investigate the massive tract of land it sat on. And to ensure I survived long enough to claim my true inheritance, he handed me the exact digital weapon required to send them all to federal prison. I closed the final document and shut my laptop with a satisfying click. The heavy rain outside the diner had completely stopped, leaving the morning air clean, crisp, and bright. I finished the last drop of my coffee and left a $20 bill on the Formica table. I walked out to my car, the cool mountain wind brushing against my face. I was no longer the forgotten archivist operating in the shadows. I was the sole executive director of Blue Ridge LLC. I had a federal corporate audit to watch unfold, and a massive billionaire empire of my own to build. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, the engine idling quietly, while the morning sun illuminated the damp dashboard. I could have driven away right then. I could have headed straight back to Atlanta and waited for the federal agents to tear Vivian and Darren apart. But my training as an archivist demanded absolute thoroughness. A historical record is never complete until every single page has been turned and every footnote verified. I opened my laptop again and navigated back into the heavily encrypted master directory of Blue Ridge LLC. The 5,000 acres of Appalachian corridor land was just the first folder. I scrolled down the screen, discovering a subdirectory labeled Intellectual Property. I clicked it open and my jaw physically dropped. Grandfather Thomas had not just secured the physical future of the shipping industry through the mountain corridor. He had secured the digital heart of the current empire. Wilson Logistics operated on a highly advanced proprietary routing algorithm. It was the absolute lifeblood of the company, a predictive software model that optimized freight loads, fuel consumption, and delivery schedules with terrifying accuracy. It was the reason they dominated the entire eastern seaboard and crushed their competitors. I opened the patent filings and scanned the dense legal text. Wilson Logistics did not own the algorithm. Blue Ridge LLC owned it. Grandfather had patented the software entirely under the shell company years ago. He had then drafted an exclusive licensing agreement allowing Wilson Logistics to use the software for their daily operations. I pulled up the terms of the agreement. The legal language was bulletproof. The license was entirely revocable at the sole discretion of the Blue Ridge LLC executive director. I could completely shut down their entire global shipping network with a single keystroke. Without that software, their trucks would stop moving, their warehouses would paralyze, and their delivery contracts would instantly void. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the next folder labeled Commercial Real Estate Leases. I scanned the property deeds and burst into a sharp, breathless laugh. The glittering corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta, the very building where Calvin and Darren had just sneered at me, was not owned by the family trust. It was built on land leased directly from Blue Ridge LLC. Grandfather had structured a 99-year ground lease, but he had included a specific morality clause. If any executive of the tenant company was found guilty of financial misconduct, the lease could be terminated immediately without any right to appeal. I pulled up the residential deeds. Maya's spectacular $15 million mansion, the one she had flaunted on the video call, while mocking my cabin, was also built on a leased parcel owned entirely by my shell company. Darren and Maya did not own the ground beneath their designer shoes. Grandfather Thomas had engineered the ultimate legal failsafe. He knew his family was greedy and entitled. He knew Vivian, Jamal, and Darren would eventually try to strip the company for parts and consolidate their own wealth. So he legally severed the actual foundation of the empire and placed it securely in the hands of the only granddaughter he trusted. He did not leave me a useless cabin. He left me the keys to the entire kingdom. He made me their landlord, their software provider, and their ultimate judge. They were currently sitting in a glass castle built entirely on land I owned, operating a company powered by software I controlled. As I processed the sheer magnitude of my absolute power, a sharp chime echoed through the quiet car. A notification flashed in the upper right corner of my laptop screen. It was an email forwarded to my personal account from an automated corporate industry newsletter I monitored. The subject line was stamped urgent. I opened the email and a glossy digital invitation filled my screen, complete with the gold-embossed Wilson Logistics corporate crest. Vivian and Jamal were hosting a lavish exclusive rebranding gala at the downtown headquarters this upcoming Saturday night. I read the press release attached to the invitation, and my blood ran cold. The gala was not just a celebration, it was a formal corporate announcement. Vivian and Jamal were publicly declaring the immediate sale of Wilson Logistics to Apex Global, a massive aggressive corporate rival based in Europe. The pieces of their strategy snapped into place with crystal clarity. Darren and Jamal knew the company was bleeding cash from their massive embezzlement. They knew the internal structure was rotting from the inside out, and that standard quarterly audits would eventually expose the missing capital. They were orchestrating a highly publicized aggressive merger to liquidate the company entirely. They intended to cash out their stolen millions and walk away with a massive golden parachute before the board of directors or any external auditors could discover the gutted pension funds. They were trying to finalize the sale before the end of the fiscal quarter. They thought they had destroyed the only evidence of their crimes when Darren crushed that decoy hard drive in his office. They thought I was neutralized and silenced permanently. They had absolutely no idea that a silent Trojan virus was currently delivering their fraudulent tax records straight to the federal government. But federal audits take time to process and organize. Bureaucracy moves slowly, even when handed perfect evidence. If Vivian and Jamal pushed the sale through and liquidated the company before the authorities mobilized, they could potentially flee the country with their offshore accounts completely intact. They would leave the European buyers holding a hollowed-out shell of a company, and they would escape entirely unpunished. I could not wait for the government to move. I had to stop the sale myself. I had to crash their perfect glittering gala and burn their illusion of victory to the ground. They had publicly humiliated me. They had stripped me of my dignity, threatened my freedom, and convinced the man I loved to betray me for a paycheck. Now they were going to throw a party to celebrate their theft. I closed my laptop and gripped the steering wheel. I was no longer the quiet archivist who hid in the basement restoring old books. I was the sole executive director of Blue Ridge LLC. I owned the ground they walked on, and I owned the digital infrastructure that made them rich. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the diner parking lot, heading back toward Atlanta. I had less than 48 hours to prepare. I needed to draft the immediate eviction notices for the corporate headquarters and Maya's mansion. I needed to formalize the software license revocation. And I needed to find the perfect dress. If Vivian and Jamal wanted to host a grand finale to sell off my grandfather's legacy, I was going to ensure it was a night the corporate world would never forget. I pulled off the highway and navigated the winding, tree-lined streets of Buckhead. I was not going back to my cramped apartment. I needed a legal mind that rivaled Calvin's but possessed a moral compass he severely lacked. I needed Eleanor Sterling. Eleanor was a legend in the Atlanta corporate sphere. She was a brilliant, fiercely loyal African-American attorney who had fought tooth and nail alongside grandfather Thomas for 3 decades to build Wilson Logistics from a regional trucking company into a global powerhouse. She was his general counsel and his most trusted advisor. 2 years ago, Vivian and Jamal orchestrated a brutal boardroom coup, feeding the board fabricated performance reviews to push Eleanor into early retirement. They replaced her with a team of spineless corporate yes-men who would look the other way while they raided the pension funds. I knew Eleanor despised Vivian just as much as I did. I parked in front of her elegant brick townhome and marched up the walkway. When she opened the door, her sharp, dark eyes immediately registered the exhausted but feral look on my face. She did not ask questions. She simply stepped aside and ushered me into her private study. I opened my laptop and showed her everything. I walked her through the fake hard drive, the Trojan virus, the impending federal audit, and finally, the hidden master directory. I watched as this formidable veteran attorney reviewed the corporate structuring of Blue Ridge LLC. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across her face. "Thomas, you magnificent old bastard," she whispered, shaking her head in sheer admiration. He outplayed them from the grave Nia. He built a fortress they could never breach because they were too arrogant to look down at the dirt they were standing on. We did not waste a single second celebrating. We went straight to war. For the next 36 hours, Eleanor's quiet study transformed into a high-stakes corporate war room. We did not act on pure rage. Rage is sloppy. We acted with surgical precision. Eleanor utilized her secure legal terminals to pull the original lease agreements, the software patents, and the merger filings that Vivian had submitted for the Apex Global sale. We systematically dismantled their entire operation on paper. First, we fortified my position. Eleanor drafted the necessary legal declarations, formally activating my status as the sole active executive director and absolute proprietor of Blue Ridge LLC. We registered the paperwork with the state utilizing expedited corporate channels. Within hours, my authority over the 5,000 acres, the proprietary routing algorithm, and the ground leases was legally unassailable. Then we prepared the ammunition. We drafted a formal patent revocation filing. The language was cold and irrefutable. As the rightful owner of the routing software, Blue Ridge LLC was immediately pulling Wilson Logistics' license to operate the system due to massive breaches of the morality and corporate compliance clauses. Next came the eviction notices. Eleanor printed them on heavy, high-quality legal stock. The first notice was for the downtown corporate headquarters, giving Jamal and Darren exactly 0 days to vacate the premises due to felony financial misconduct. The second notice was a direct strike at Maya. We drafted a total forfeiture of the residential ground lease for her $15 million estate. She had built a palace on land she did not own, and I was taking it back. Finally, we constructed the ultimate cease and desist order. It was a formal legal injunction specifically addressed to the executives of Apex Global. It detailed that Wilson Logistics had absolutely no legal authority to sell their routing network or their corporate headquarters because they did not own either asset. If Apex Global proceeded with the acquisition, they would be buying an empty, bankrupt shell actively under federal investigation. We placed each devastating document into sleek black leather portfolios. We were building a guillotine, and Vivian was about to happily place her own head inside it. As Friday evening descended, the tension in the air grew thick and heavy. The rebranding gala was only 24 hours away. I was sitting at Eleanor's mahogany desk, reviewing the final injunction, when my cell phone vibrated violently against the wood. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from Vivian. I picked it up and read the words. I know you are still in the city, Nia. Do not even think about pulling a stunt tomorrow night. Security has your photograph at every entrance. If you try to show your embarrassing face at my gala, you will be arrested on site for trespassing and corporate espionage. Calvin has the police on standby. Crawl back into your hole and stay there. I stared at the glowing screen. A week ago, a message like this from my mother would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety and self-doubt. I would have questioned my own sanity and backed down. Now the words meant absolutely nothing. They were just the hollow threats of a woman standing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely oblivious to the water rising around her ankles. I did not type a reply. I simply locked the screen and tossed the phone back onto the desk. Eleanor watched me over the rim of her reading glasses. Is she threatening you again? Just barking, I replied smoothly. She thinks I am a trespasser. She does not realize she is my tenant. Eleanor let out a sharp laugh and closed her legal pad. We have everything we need, Nia. The documents are perfectly executed. The trap is set. Now you just need to look the part. You cannot walk into a corporate slaughter wearing a rain jacket and boots. You need armor. I nodded. She was right. Vivian, Jamal, and Darren expected the quiet, mousy archivist who hid in the background and let them steal the spotlight. They expected the girl who wore sensible cardigans and kept her head down. I was going to give them a completely different person. Saturday morning, I took the very last of my personal savings and walked into an exclusive high-end boutique in the upscale shopping district. I bypassed the racks of elegant evening gowns and cocktail dresses. I was not attending a party. I was attending an execution. I found exactly what I needed. It was a flawless, razor-sharp, tailored power suit in a deep, striking crimson red. The cut was immaculate, the fabric expensive and commanding. I paired it with a crisp black silk blouse and black stiletto heels that echoed against the marble floor of the boutique like a ticking clock. I sat in the salon chair and let a stylist pull my hair back into a sleek, severe updo, highlighting the sharp angles of my face. I wore minimal makeup, focusing only on a bold, dark red lip that matched the suit perfectly. When I finally stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The insecure girl who had begged her family for scraps of affection was completely dead. The woman in the mirror was a titan. She was the sole heir to the Thomas Logistics empire. She was the executive director of Blue Ridge LLC, and she was absolutely lethal. I returned to Eleanor's townhome as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the city. Eleanor was waiting in the foyer holding the stack of black leather portfolios. She wore a stunning emerald green evening gown, looking every bit the formidable general counsel she truly was. She had insisted on accompanying me to the gala, not just as my attorney but as my witness. But she wanted to see the look on Vivian's face when the empire finally fell. "You look magnificent, Nia," Eleanor said, handing me the heavy portfolios. "Thomas would be incredibly proud of you right now." I took the documents, feeling the solid weight of the paper in my hands. "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything." We walked out to her waiting town car and slid into the back seat. The driver merged onto the highway, heading straight for the glittering downtown skyline. The corporate headquarters of Wilson Logistics loomed in the distance, a massive spire of glass and steel dominating the city block. I knew the grand ballroom on the top floor would be packed with hundreds of industry executives, wealthy investors, and the smug, self-assured members of the Apex Global Acquisition team. Vivian, Jamal, and Darren were going to stand on that stage and raise a glass to their own brilliance. They were going to toast to the millions they thought they had successfully stolen. Calvin would be standing right beside them, sipping champagne and congratulating himself on his brilliant betrayal. I looked down at the eviction notices resting in my lap. I was not just going to stop the sale. I was going to humiliate them in front of the entire corporate world. I was going to strip them of their titles, their wealth, and their unearned arrogance on a live microphone. The quiet archivist was gone forever. The rightful heir had arrived, and I was ready for war. The town car glided to a smooth halt at the edge of the red carpet, rolling out from the glass facade of the Wilson Logistics downtown headquarters. The rain from earlier had left the streets slick, reflecting the flashing neon and bright city lights. Flashbulbs strobed like a violent, continuous lightning storm as the city elite poured through the main entrance. Politicians, media moguls, and international investors crowded the velvet ropes, eager to witness the highly publicized corporate merger. Eleanor and I did not join the primary line. We bypassed the bustling valet station and moved deliberately toward the private executive entrance on the south wing. Two towering security guards stood before the frosted glass doors, holding electronic guest lists and wearing discreet earpieces. I did not break my stride. I stepped up to the digital keypad mounted on the reinforced steel frame and punched in the 12-digit alphanumeric sequence. It was the master override code Grandfather Thomas had hardwired into the building mainframe years ago. It was a backdoor channel that Darren and Jamal were completely oblivious to. The heavy magnetic locks disengaged with a loud mechanical clunk. The guard stepped forward looking confused and ready to intervene, but Eleanor flashed a cold, withering glare that froze them in place. We stepped inside the private corridor, leaving the chaos of the street behind. The private elevator whisked us silently to the penthouse level. When the brushed steel doors parted, the sheer scale of the rebranding gala hit me like a physical wave. The grand ballroom was a dazzling, suffocating display of stolen wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over massive, intricately carved ice sculptures and overflowing champagne towers. A string quartet played a lively symphony in the corner, attempting to add an air of sophisticated old money to a room full of thieves. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful figures in the global financial sector. Men in custom tuxedos and women in haute couture mingled effortlessly, entirely unaware that they were standing in a corporate graveyard. I scanned the massive space until my eyes locked onto the main event. At the far end of the ballroom stood an elevated mahogany stage, bathed in bright theatrical spotlights. It was staged perfectly for a corporate coronation. Vivian, Jamal, Maya, and Darren stood shoulder to shoulder, radiating unearned triumph. Vivian wore a glittering silver gown that caught every flash of the photographer's cameras. Maya was dripping in diamonds draped over her husband Darren, who looked insufferably smug. And standing right beside them, organizing a stack of thick legal portfolios, was Calvin. His hair was perfectly styled, his tailored suit immaculate. He looked entirely at home among the predators who had bought his loyalty. Behind them stretched a massive high-definition presentation screen displaying the intertwined logos of Wilson Logistics and Apex Global. An ornate antique desk sat in the center of the stage, holding the final acquisition paperwork and a row of expensive fountain pens. They were literal moments away from signing away my grandfather's legacy and cashing out their stolen millions to disappear forever. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the center of the ballroom. Eleanor flanked me, her presence demanding immediate respect from anyone who recognized the legendary former general counsel. My crimson-red power suit cut through the sea of black tuxedos and muted gowns like a freshly sharpened blade. My stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I did not try to blend in. I projected absolute unyielding authority. As I moved through the crowd, people naturally stepped aside, parting to create a wide path. A ripple of curious whispers began to spread outward from my wake. Someone near the front bumped into a waiter, sending a tray of champagne flutes crashing to the floor. The shattering glass echoed sharply over the music. The string quartet faltered and the music abruptly stopped. The sudden heavy silence drew every eye in the room directly to me. On the stage, Vivian turned her head sharply. Her perfect practice smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of absolute venomous shock. Jamal took a step backward, knocking into the antique desk and sending a fountain pen clattering to the floor. Maya gasped, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. Darren's smug grin dissolved into a hard defensive scowl. Calvin simply froze, his hands hovering motionless over the acquisition documents. For a split second, the entire ballroom was suspended in perfect absolute silence. Then Vivian recovered, her vicious instincts kicking in. She snatched a wireless microphone from the podium and marched to the edge of the stage. Her voice boomed through the massive surround sound speakers, echoing off the crystal chandeliers and filling every corner of the vast room. "Well, look who decided to crash the party," Vivian announced, her tone dripping with mock pity and sharp cruelty. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse the interruption. This is my niece, Nia. She is a deeply troubled, deranged young woman who has been struggling with severe jealousy issues ever since she was rightfully cut out of her grandfather's will. She clearly could not handle the reality of her own failures and has decided to throw a desperate public tantrum." The crowd murmured, shifting uncomfortably in their expensive suits and gowns. The flashbulbs intensified as journalists turned their cameras away from the stage and aimed them directly at me. Vivian paced the stage, gesturing dismissively with her free hand. She wanted to crush me in front of the entire city. "She has absolutely no business being here tonight," Vivian continued, her voice rising with theatrical authority. "She is nothing but a bitter dropout who spends her days playing with dusty library books while the real adults handle actual business. She could not accept that her grandfather saw her incompetence and chose to leave the future of this company in capable hands. Please do not let her embarrassing display ruin our celebration." Up on the stage, Calvin leaned close to Darren. He did not bother covering his mouth, his arrogant whisper carrying just loud enough for the front row of journalists and investors to hear clearly. "She is just here to beg for scraps," Calvin sneered, shaking his head and looking down at me with utter contempt. "She has zero leverage left. I took everything she had. Just let security drag her out and let us get back to the signing." Darren chuckled, adjusting his tie and nodding sharply to the perimeter guards. 4 massive security personnel in dark suits immediately detached from the walls and rushed forward, moving aggressively to flank me. Their hands reached out, ready to grab my arms and physically drag me out of the ballroom in front of the flashing cameras and the mocking eyes of my family. They expected me to scream, to cry, to fight back fruitlessly like a cornered animal. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply stood my ground, locking eyes with Calvin and letting a cold, lethal smile spread across my face. I reached into the pocket of my crimson jacket and pulled out a small, sleek black remote control. It was a customized archival interface trigger synced directly to the master servers I now completely controlled. Vivian saw the device and scoffed, gripping the microphone tighter. "What is that, Naya? Are you going to threaten us with a presentation clicker? Security, remove this hysterical woman from my building immediately." The guards lunged forward, closing the final few feet between us. I raised the small remote control and pressed a single button. I did not say a word. The result was instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic for their perfect evening. The massive high-definition presentation screens behind the stage, the ones proudly displaying the corporate merger logos, flickered violently. A loud electronic screech echoed through the surround sound speakers, overriding Vivian's microphone with a deafening burst of static. The screens went entirely pitch black. For 5 agonizing seconds, the grand ballroom plunged into a state of bewildered murmurs. The darkness was absolute, a stark contrast to the glittering opulence from just moments before. Then, with a sharp electronic hum, the massive 50-foot presentation screens violently flickered back to life. They did not display the sleek, interconnected logos of the highly anticipated corporate merger. They displayed the raw, undeniable truth. Massive, high-definition spreadsheets flooded the displays, casting a harsh, sterile white glow over the stunned faces of the corporate elite. I had bypassed the local audio-visual booth, completely routing the master files directly from the encrypted federal servers I had triggered earlier that morning. The first slide was a master index of Darren's shadow accounting. Bold red highlights illuminated thousands of illegal bank transfers, offshore routing numbers in the Cayman Islands, and meticulously forged vendor contracts. Every single stolen dollar was meticulously tracked, categorized, and displayed in font large enough for the executives at the very back of the room to read clearly. I tapped the remote again. The screen transitioned to a split display. On the left was the original legitimate balance sheet of Wilson Logistics as filed by Grandfather Thomas. On the right was the heavily manipulated falsified ledger Darren had submitted to Apex Global for the acquisition. The discrepancy was in the hundreds of millions. I highlighted the exact dummy corporations Vivian and Jamal had created to siphon the pension funds. I even included a massive blown-up image of Calvin's authorized legal signature, explicitly signing off on the fraudulent offshore wire transfers just hours after he had stolen the decoy hard drive from my hands. It took exactly 10 seconds for the reality of the display to set in. The collective gasp of the ballroom sucked the oxygen right out of the air. The elite investors, the politicians, and the media moguls stared upward in absolute horrified comprehension. The company they were gathered to celebrate the billion-dollar empire Apex Global was about to purchase was nothing but a hollowed-out, rotting fraud. Then the chaos erupted. The polite applause and sophisticated murmurs instantly shattered into a deafening roar of shouting and panic. The lead executives from the Apex Global Acquisition team, who had been raising champagne flutes on the stage just moments ago, violently threw their glasses to the floor. They turned on Vivian, their faces purple with rage, demanding immediate answers. The journalists in the room, who had initially lowered their cameras, realizing the PR speech was interrupted, now hoisted their lenses like weapons. The flashbulbs ignited into a blinding, continuous strobe, capturing every single second of the corporate slaughter. "Turn it off!" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic as he lunged toward the edge of the stage. "Cut the power! Cut the feed right now!" He waved frantically at the elevated audio-visual booth suspended above the ballroom floor. I could see the technicians frantically slamming their hands against their mixing consoles, tearing out cords, and typing desperately on their keyboards. It was completely useless. I had written the override protocol to lock out all local network commands. The system was entirely hardwired to my remote interface. The only way to stop the broadcast was to physically sever the main power lines to the building, and even then the federal authorities already had the exact same files sitting on their desks. On the stage, the illusion of absolute power had completely evaporated. Vivian stood frozen, her mouth hanging open, her designer silver gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Maya backed away from the presentation screens, her hands trembling as she realized her $15 million mansion was funded by the very felonies currently broadcast to the world. Calvin, the brilliant legal mastermind, looked like a cornered rat. His eyes darted toward the emergency exit, calculating his escape route. He knew his career, his freedom, and his pristine reputation were instantly pulverized. But Darren did not freeze. Darren snapped. The arrogant CFO realized his entire life was over. The smug superiority vanished, replaced by blind animalistic fury. He let out a visceral roar of rage, leaping off the front of the mahogany stage and hitting the marble floor with a heavy thud. "I will kill you!" he bellowed, his face contorted into a mask of pure violence. He shoved past a pair of terrified investors, knocking a cocktail table to the ground as he charged directly at me. His fists were balled, his eyes locked onto my face with murderous intent. The four security guards who had previously surrounded me hesitated, unsure whether to protect the company executive or intervene in an assault. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply stood my ground, watching the corporate shark devolve into a feral thug. Before Darren could close the final 10 feet of distance, the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive entrance slammed open. Eleanor Sterling marched into the grand ballroom, flanked by 6 towering, heavily armed private security contractors. They were not the standard event security hired for the gala. They were elite tactical professionals Eleanor kept on permanent retainer. 2 of the contractors intercepted Darren with brutal efficiency. They grabbed him mid-stride, twisting his arms behind his back and slamming him face first onto a shattered cocktail table. Darren thrashed and screamed, spitting curses at me, but the contractors held him pinned against the marble floor with unyielding force. Eleanor stepped forward, adjusting the cuffs of her emerald green evening gown. She looked down at the struggling CFO with absolute freezing contempt. "You are trespassing on private property, Mr. Cross," she stated, her voice carrying a lethal calm. "I suggest you stop resisting before these gentlemen interpret your actions as a direct threat to the rightful owner of this estate." The physical takedown of the chief financial officer sent another massive shockwave through the ballroom. The remaining security personnel immediately backed away, realizing the shift in power was absolute. The Apex Global executives were currently shouting into their cell phones, screaming at their legal teams to halt any pending wire transfers. A young journalist standing a few feet away from me was holding a high-quality wireless broadcast microphone, her hands visibly shaking as she captured the chaos. I stepped toward her. She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock, and wordlessly offered me the microphone. I took it, wrapping my fingers around the cool metal handle. I turned to face the stage where Vivian was currently clutching the podium, looking completely cornered. Her face was ashen, the venomous confidence utterly drained from her veins. I raised the microphone. My voice echoed through the massive speakers, cutting through the shouting and the panic with absolute chilling calmness. "My mother told you I was a deranged, jealous woman." I began pacing slowly in front of the stage, ensuring every single camera in the room was focused squarely on my face. "She told you I was a bitter dropout hiding in a library, unable to comprehend the brilliant business strategies of the adults in the room. She told you I was here to beg for scraps." I stopped directly in front of Vivian, locking eyes with the woman who had spent my entire life trying to erase me. "I am not here to beg, Vivian. I am here to evict you." The ballroom fell into a stunned, hushed silence. The only sounds were the clicking of camera shutters and Darren's muffled curses from the floor. "You thought you were outsmarting a naive archivist?" I continued, my voice projecting crisp and clear. "You believed that destroying a physical hard drive in your office would erase the historical record of your crimes. You forgot that an archivist's entire purpose is to protect the truth from those who wish to burn it. The files you see behind you were transmitted to the Internal Revenue Service, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the FBI hours before you even put on that silver gown." I turned my gaze to Calvin, who was desperately trying to inch his way toward the service elevator. Calvin thought he could leverage 2 years of false affection into a corner office. He thought stealing my decoy drive would guarantee his partnership track. I pointed directly at him, the camera operators immediately pivoting to capture his panicked retreat. Instead, he willingly signed his own name to a multi-million-dollar wire fraud conspiracy. He provided the exact legal authorization required to seal his own federal indictment. Calvin froze, the color draining completely from his handsome face as the lenses zoomed in on his terror. I turned back to the crowd, addressing the pale, sweating executives of Apex Global. "To the acquisition team from Apex, I apologize for ruining your celebration," I said, my tone perfectly polite but sharp as glass. "However, you should know that Wilson Logistics has absolutely no legal right to sell you this company. The proprietary routing algorithm you are attempting to purchase does not belong to them. It is owned by Blue Ridge LLC, a company of which I am the sole executive director. As of this evening, I have officially revoked their operating license. Furthermore, this building, the ground you are currently standing on, is leased from my holding company. I have terminated their lease due to felony financial misconduct. I looked back up at the stage, my eyes sweeping over Jamal, who was gripping his hair in despair, Maya, who was openly weeping, and Vivian, who looked as though she had turned to stone. "You do not own the software," I declared, my voice ringing with finality. "You do not own the land. You do not have a company to sell. Grandfather Thomas knew exactly what you were. He knew you would strip this empire for parts to feed your own endless greed. So he handed you the rotting shell to keep you distracted, and he handed me the foundation." I lowered the microphone, the weight of my absolute victory settling over the silent ballroom. The police sirens were already wailing in the distance, the sound cutting through the rainy Atlanta night, growing louder by the second. The public execution was complete, and the empire was finally mine. The sirens outside grew louder, a mechanical wail slicing through the heavy rain. Inside the grand ballroom, the silence was suffocating. I stood perfectly still, letting the reality of the massive high-definition presentation screens sink into the minds of the city elite. The displays continued to scroll through the damning evidence of their fraud, every illegal bank transfer, every offshore account in the Cayman Islands. It was a towering digital monument to their greed, and it was broadcasting live to every major investor in Atlanta. Jamal broke the silence. He was sweating profusely, heavy drops beating on his forehead and rolling down his neck to stain the crisp white collar of his custom tuxedo. He lunged for the microphone. Vivian had dropped his hands, shaking so violently he nearly fumbled the sleek metal cylinder. He turned his back on me and faced the Apex Global Acquisition team, his eyes wide and frantic. He was a desperate man watching his golden parachute burn in midair. "Listen to me," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Do not listen to a single word this woman says. She is entirely insane." He pointed a trembling finger at me, gesturing wildly. "She is a disgruntled, estranged relative who has spent the last 5 years harboring a pathetic grudge against her own family. These documents on the screen are entirely fabricated. She hacked our servers to project fake spreadsheets. She holds absolutely no legal power over Wilson Logistics. We are the executive board. We have the shareholder majority. She is nothing but a low-level archivist, throwing a temper tantrum because she wants attention. Please, I assure you all the acquisition is completely secure. We just need to have security remove her from the premises, and we can finalize the paperwork immediately." Jamal turned to the Apex Global CEO, a tall, silver-haired industry veteran named Richard Vance, who was currently staring at the stage with absolute horror. Jamal reached out to him, extending a pleading hand. "Richard, please let us proceed. This is just a minor security breach." Before Richard Vance could even formulate a response, Eleanor Sterling made her move. She stepped up to the mahogany stage, her emerald green gown sweeping across the marble floor. Her presence alone commanded the kind of deep inherent respect Jamal could never buy with stolen money. The private security contractors flanked her, creating an impenetrable human wall between her and the disgraced executives. She carried the heavy black leather portfolios we had meticulously prepared in her study. She did not rush. She moved with the deliberate, lethal grace of an apex predator closing in on its prey. Eleanor reached the center of the stage and stopped directly in front of Jamal. She looked at him with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. She raised the thick stack of legal filings and slammed them down onto the antique desk, right on top of the pending Apex Global Acquisition contracts. The heavy, physical thud of the paper echoed sharply through the ballroom, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "You have been formally served," Jamal Eleanor stated, her voice ringing out with chilling legal authority. "These are certified court injunctions, patent revocations, and immediate eviction notices filed and expedited through the federal judiciary. I strongly suggest you retain competent criminal defense counsel immediately, because your corporate lawyers can no longer help you." I stepped forward, raising my own microphone. The room hung on my every word. The journalists were recording every single second of this historical corporate collapse, their cameras focused squarely on my face. "Jamal claims I have no legal power," I said, projecting my voice to reach the very back of the room. "He claims I am just a disgruntled relative with fake spreadsheets. Let me clarify my exact position for the Apex Global Executive Team and for every single investor in this room today." I locked eyes with Richard Vance, the Apex CEO. "I am the sole active executive director and absolute proprietor of Blue Ridge LLC. For years, the current board of Wilson Logistics assumed Blue Ridge was nothing more than a dusty holding company, a forgotten relic of my grandfather's eccentric corporate structuring. They were too arrogant and too lazy to actually read the foundational corporate charters. If they had, they would have realized that Blue Ridge LLC is not a subsidiary of Wilson Logistics. It is the master entity." I began to pace the floor, my crimson suit commanding the space as I dismantled their empire piece by piece. "Blue Ridge LLC owns the patents for every single piece of proprietary software Wilson Logistics utilizes," I declared, my voice echoing with undeniable power. "Every line of code, every automated routing algorithm, the entire logistical brain that coordinates the fleet, tracks the global shipments, and predicts the market fluctuations. Wilson Logistics does not own that technology. They merely license it from my company. And due to the massive, irrefutable breaches of the morality and corporate compliance clauses embedded deeply within those contracts, I have officially revoked that license." I watched the color completely drain from the faces of the Apex Global team. They were a technology-driven logistics firm. They were buying Wilson Logistics specifically for that advanced routing algorithm. Without it, they were buying a fleet of rapidly depreciating metal boxes. But that is not all. I continued, refusing to give them a single second to breathe. "Blue Ridge LLC also owns the land. We own the ground leases for the primary distribution hubs. We own the 5,000 acres of prime industrial real estate that houses your fleet. And most importantly, we own the exact plot of earth that this very building sits on. You do not own the headquarters, Vivian. You do not own the warehouses, Jamal. You are merely tenants. Tenants who are currently in default and actively under federal investigation for massive corporate embezzlement." I gestured toward the screen behind them. "As of 5 o'clock this evening, my legal counsel filed total forfeiture and immediate eviction notices for every single property operated by Wilson Logistics." I turned to face the Apex CEO, directly delivering the final devastating blow. "Mr. Vance," I said, my tone perfectly level and absolutely ruthless, "if you sign that contract tonight, you are not acquiring a billion-dollar global empire. You are acquiring a bankrupt empty shell. You will inherit a company with no operating software, no distribution centers, no corporate headquarters, and a massive mountain of federal indictments. You will be buying billions of dollars in toxic liability. Wilson Logistics is completely worthless. I have stripped it down to the studs in a matter of seconds." Richard Vance stared at me, then looked up at the massive screens displaying the undeniable proof of the embezzlement. He looked down at the heavy legal filings Eleanor had slammed onto the desk. He was a seasoned corporate veteran, and he instantly recognized a lethal trap when he saw one. He realized how terrifyingly close he had come to destroying his own pristine company by absorbing their toxic debt. Vance's face turned purple with a completely different kind of rage. He turned his glare onto Vivian and Jamal. "You tried to sell me a rotting corpse," he growled, his voice vibrating with barely contained fury. "You lied on your financial disclosures. You falsified your ledgers. You tried to drag my company into your federal nightmare." Jamal held up his hands, backing away from the furious CEO. "Richard, wait, we can explain. We can renegotiate the terms. We can figure this out." "There is no renegotiation," Vance roared. He stepped up to the antique desk, grabbed the thick stack of the Apex Global acquisition contracts, and ripped them directly in half. The sound of tearing thick paper cut through the tension. He threw the shredded documents into the air, letting the heavy paper snow down over the stage in a humiliating display of ultimate rejection. "The deal is dead. My legal team will be contacting the authorities immediately to offer our full cooperation in your prosecution. Do not ever attempt to contact me or my firm again." Vance turned on his heel, signaling to his executive team. They immediately abandoned the stage, pushing their way through the crowd of stunned investors and marching straight toward the exit. The grand corporate merger, the event that was supposed to cement Vivian and Jamal's status as industry titans, was officially dead on the floor. The ballroom descended into absolute pandemonium. Investors were shouting into their phones frantically, ordering their brokers to dump any remaining stock associated with the Wilson family. The journalists were practically sprinting toward the stage, shouting rapid-fire questions at the paralyzed executives. The police sirens outside had reached the front of the building, the flashing blue and red lights reflecting vividly off the rain-slicked windows. I walked slowly to the edge of the stage. Darren was still pinned to the floor by Eleanor's security team, groaning in total defeat. Calvin was backed against a wall, looking pale and terrified like a ghost. Maya had collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably, ruining her expensive makeup. Vivian was staring blankly ahead, completely broken, her empire shattered beyond any hope of repair. I stopped directly in front of Jamal. He looked down at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the realization that he had lost absolutely everything. He had spent years underestimating me, treating me like a compliant, quiet ghost who would simply fade into the background while he stole my birthright. He had never seen the real me until this exact moment. I looked right into his desperate eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The microphone amplified my final words, carrying them over the chaos of the ruined gala. "The sale of Wilson Logistics is officially voided," I stated, my voice as cold and hard as steel. "You have absolutely nothing left to sell, Jamal. Your access is revoked, your accounts are frozen, your empire is paralyzed. You are done." The echo of my voice had barely faded into the cavernous ceiling when the heavy main doors of the ballroom burst open. The wail of the sirens that had been growing steadily louder outside abruptly cut off, replaced by the sharp, authoritative bark of federal law enforcement. Dozens of agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS emblazoned across their backs swarmed into the room. They moved with absolute tactical precision. The terrified murmurs of the wealthy investors turned into frantic shrieks as the crowd violently parted. High society socialites and billionaire moguls scrambled backward, tripping over their own expensive gowns and formal shoes to clear a wide path. They knew exactly what this meant, and nobody wanted to be standing too close to the blast radius. The Trojan virus I had unleashed into the corporate servers had executed its mission flawlessly. It had not just locked them out of the system, it had gathered every single piece of encrypted data, every hidden offshore account ledger, and every falsified tax return, and delivered it directly into the hands of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The agents did not come to ask questions or serve subpoenas. They came with signed arrest warrants. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from stone, marched straight past the shattered ice sculptures and headed directly for the stage. He bypassed Vivian and Jamal, entirely zeroing in on the man currently being held against the marble floor by Eleanor's security team. Eleanor gave a brief nod to her contractors. They stepped back, pulling Darren to his feet and shoving him roughly into the waiting arms of the federal agents. "Darren Cross, you are under arrest," the lead agent declared, his voice booming over the chaos of the ballroom. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." Darren struggled, his face turning a blotchy, violently unhealthy shade of purple. "This is a mistake," he screamed, spit flying from his lips as he writhed against the agent's iron grip. "You cannot do this. I am the chief financial officer. I have lawyers. I have friends in the mayor's office. You are arresting the wrong people. She is the one who hacked us." The agents ignored his pathetic rambling completely, the harsh metallic snap of handcuffs echoing loudly as they locked his wrists firmly behind his back. The absolute indignity of the moment was staggering. Darren, the man who had mocked me, who had spent years siphoning millions to fund his lavish lifestyle, was now being paraded through a crowd of his peers like a common thief. His bespoke tuxedo was wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne, his dignity entirely stripped away. While the cameras flashed rapidly, capturing Darren's humiliating exit, my eyes scanned the perimeter of the room. Chaos is an excellent cover for a coward, and Calvin was the ultimate coward. I spotted him trying to use the frantic movement of the crowd to slip away unnoticed. He was inching along the far wall, keeping to the shadows, his eyes locked on the red glow of the service elevator exit sign. He thought his pristine reputation could still be salvaged if he simply vanished into the night. He did not make it. Before Calvin's hand could even graze the heavy brass handle of the exit door, Eleanor Sterling materialized directly in his path. She stood tall, blocking his escape route, with the immovable presence of a seasoned litigator who had destroyed men twice his size. Her private security detail fanned out behind her, ensuring there was no possible avenue of retreat. Calvin froze, his charming facade completely dissolving. "Eleanor, please," he stammered, his voice dropping an octave as he desperately tried to leverage their shared legal background. "You know I was just following orders. I am a junior partner. I had no choice." They forced my hand. "I can help you prosecute them. I can be your star witness." Eleanor did not even blink. She reached into her leather portfolio and extracted a single crisp white envelope. She pressed it firmly against Calvin's chest, forcing him to take it. "You are not a witness, Calvin," Eleanor said, her tone carrying the chilling weight of a judge delivering a life sentence. "You are an active co-conspirator." Inside that envelope is a formal notice from the State Bar Association. "I have personally filed a comprehensive grievance detailing your direct involvement in corporate extortion, evidence tampering, and the facilitation of wire fraud. Attached to that grievance is the digital footprint of your unauthorized access to my client's private servers and the security footage of you stealing proprietary hardware." Calvin stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. His hands shook violently. "You are done practicing law in this state, or any other state," Eleanor continued, her eyes locking him in a death grip. "Your license is effectively suspended as of this moment, and the federal agents currently arresting your boss will be highly interested in your testimony. I suggest you turn yourself in before they come kicking your door down." Calvin leaned back against the wall, slowly sliding down until he hit the floor. The brilliant, handsome lawyer who had thought he could manipulate my feelings to secure his own wealth was entirely broken. His career was ash. His reputation was incinerated. He was going to federal prison and he knew it. I turned my attention back to the center of the room. Maya was completely unraveling. The sight of her husband being handcuffed and dragged out by the FBI had shattered her fragile, materialistic reality. She was weeping hysterically, falling to her knees on the marble floor. Her $15 million diamond necklace caught the flashing lights of the cameras, creating a mocking sparkle against her utter despair. She was wailing Darren's name, mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark rivers. I walked slowly toward her, the click of my heels cutting through her sobs. I held the final black portfolio in my left hand. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Maya had spent my entire life treating me like a servant, mocking my clothes, my introversion, and my dedication to the family archives. She had built her entire identity on the illusion of superiority fueled by stolen cash. I stopped right in front of her, looking down at the trembling, crying woman. Maya looked up at me, her eyes wide with terror and sudden pathetic pleading. "Nia, please," Maya sobbed, reaching out to grab the hem of my crimson trousers. "You have to stop this." Darren did not mean it. "We are family. We are sisters. You cannot do this to us. How will I survive? What about my house? What about my life?" I stepped back, pulling my fabric out of her desperate grasp. I opened the black portfolio and let a heavy piece of premium cardstock fall directly into her lap. "That is an eviction notice," I stated, my voice flat and unyielding. "You seem to have forgotten that the land your massive, sprawling estate sits on is part of the original Wilson Trust. You built a $15 million mansion on dirt that belongs entirely to Blue Ridge LLC. Because Darren funded that construction with embezzled corporate capital, you have breached the morality clause of the ground lease." Maya stared at the paper as if the words written on it were in a foreign language. She shook her head in complete denial. "No," she gasped. "No, you cannot take my house. It is mine. It is all I have left." "It was never yours, Maya," I replied coldly. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever personal items you can fit into a single vehicle and vacate the premises. If you are still on my property by tomorrow evening, I will have the local sheriff physically remove you for trespassing. Maya collapsed forward, pressing her face to the marble floor and sobbing so violently her shoulders shook. The glittering socialite had lost her husband, her wealth, and her home in the span of 5 minutes. I stepped over her, turning my sights onto the final target. Jamal. The former golden boy of the Wilson family was desperately trying to corner the remaining members of his board of directors. He was standing near the shattered remains of a champagne pyramid, pulling at the lapels of the older executives, begging them to stand by him. "We can weather this storm," Jamal pleaded, his voice raspy and frantic. "We can issue a press release. We can claim Darren acted alone as a rogue agent. We can protect the stock price. You have to back me up. I am the CEO. I am the face of this company." The board members, older men and women who cared exclusively about their own bank accounts and their own freedom, looked at Jamal as if he were highly contagious. They had just watched the FBI drag their chief financial officer out the front door. They had just watched their billion-dollar Apex Global buyout turn into dust. They knew the federal authorities would be dissecting every single financial record for the last decade, and anyone standing next to Jamal Wilson was going to go down with the ship. An older man with silver hair, the senior vice chairman of the board, physically pushed Jamal's hands away from his suit jacket. "You are not the CEO, Jamal." The chairman spat, his voice laced with venom and panic. "You are a liability. By the emergency authority vested in this board, we are formally stripping you of your title, your executive privileges, and your severance package, effective immediately. You do not speak for Wilson Logistics. You do not represent us. We are turning all internal communications over to the federal investigators, and we are washing our hands of you completely." The board members literally turned their backs on him, walking rapidly toward the exit to call their respective legal teams. Jamal was left standing entirely alone in the center of the devastated ballroom. His shoulders slumped, his mouth hung open, and his eyes were wide with a terrifying hollow realization. He had no power, he had no allies, he had no company. In exactly 10 minutes, the brutal, swift execution was complete. The dominoes had fallen with surgical precision. The golden children, the arrogant executives who had treated me like dirt and raided my grandfather's legacy, were utterly obliterated. They had lost their wealth, their freedom, their homes, and their pride. The era of their theft was over. The crown had officially changed hands, and I was the one wearing it. The chaotic storm of federal agents and panicking investors finally receded. The grand ballroom, once overflowing with the city elite, rapidly emptied. The heavy oak doors swung shut, cutting off the frantic shouts of reporters being corralled by security. The music was dead. The champagne towers stood abandoned, their crystal glasses scattered across the floor in sharp, broken shards. Only the shattered remnants of my family remained. Vivian stood entirely alone in the center of the vast marble floor. Her silver designer gown, which had sparkled so triumphantly an hour ago, now looked heavy and burdensome. She looked at Jamal, who was staring blankly at his own hands, and then at Maya, who was still weeping softly in the corner. The realization of her absolute ruin finally pierced through her ironclad arrogance. Her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the polished stone, her expensive dress pooling around her in a shimmering silver puddle. She looked up at me, and the mask of the fierce corporate matriarch dissolved into a desperate, pleading mess. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her immaculate makeup. "Nia, please." Vivian sobbed, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Please do not do this to me. I am your mother. We are blood." She crawled forward, closing the distance between us, reaching out with trembling hands. "You cannot destroy your own family, Nia. We are an African-American family in a world that wants to see us fail. We have to stick together against them. You cannot let the federal government tear down what your grandfather built. We need each other. We are blood ties. You have to show mercy." I looked down at the woman kneeling at my feet. I searched my heart for a flicker of sympathy, a shred of daughterly affection. I found absolutely nothing. I looked at the woman who had spent 30 years mocking my darker skin tone, who had erased my existence from the family portraits, who had tried to leave me destitute and broken. Her sudden appeal to racial solidarity and family loyalty was the most pathetic manipulation I had ever witnessed. She only remembered we were family when she needed a human shield. My voice was steady, completely devoid of anger or sorrow. It was the cold, hard truth. You gave me the dirt because you thought I belonged in it, I said, looking directly into her weeping eyes. You thought I was beneath you. You thought I was weak. But you forgot that dirt is where foundations are built. Vivian let out a choked gasp, shaking her head. I did not stop. Grandfather saw right through your elegant suits and your country club smiles. He knew you were hollow. He knew you would strike a match and burn his entire legacy to the ground just to keep yourselves warm. So he gave me the fire extinguisher. I turned my back on her. Vivian let out a piercing, guttural scream, calling my name and begging me to reconsider. Her shrieks bounced off the crystal chandeliers, echoing like a ghost haunting its own grave. I did not pause. I did not look back. Eleanor fell into step beside me, a quiet smile of absolute satisfaction on her face. Together we walked out of the grand double doors, leaving the ruins of Wilson Logistics behind us. We stepped into the cool, rainy night, and for the first time in my entire life, the air tasted completely clean. I inhaled deeply, feeling the heavy, suffocating chains of my family's expectations finally shatter and fall away. I was free. 3 months later, the morning air high in the Appalachian Mountains was crisp and sweet. I sat comfortably on the wraparound porch of my cabin, resting my hands against the smooth, polished wood of the railing. The structure had been beautifully restored. The rotting planks were replaced, the roof rebuilt, and the entire cabin fortified without losing a single ounce of its rustic charm. The surrounding pines swayed gently in the wind, casting dappled morning sunlight across the massive wooden deck. The air smelled of fresh pine needles and damp earth, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled oxygen of corporate boardrooms. A steaming mug of chamomile tea rested on the table beside me, sending lazy curls of vapor into the cool air. Spread out across the thick oak table were massive architectural blueprints and corporate structuring documents. They were the designs for the new global headquarters of Blue Ridge Logistics. I was not building a glass spire in the middle of a congested city to show off my wealth. I was building a sustainable, fortified command center seamlessly integrated into the landscape of the 5,000 acres I proudly owned. Eleanor had worked tirelessly over the past 90 days. The transition of power was legally flawless. The former executives of Wilson Logistics were currently navigating the brutal reality of the federal justice system. Darren was facing 20 years in federal prison for massive tax evasion and fraud. Jamal was desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal that the prosecutors were openly laughing at. Calvin had been formally disbarred and was working a minimum wage retail job while awaiting his own indictment for extortion. Maya had moved into a cramped apartment entirely cut off from the luxury she thought defined her very existence. Vivian was facing total personal bankruptcy. The authorities had seized her bank accounts, her luxury vehicles, and her remaining properties to pay back the pension funds she had so heartlessly raided. They were ghosts of a forgotten era, stripped of the unearned arrogance that had poisoned their souls. I picked up my mug and took a slow sip of the hot tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I looked out over the vast expanse of trees, watching the morning mist roll off the ancient mountains. I had taken the absolute minimum. I had accepted the $10,000 cabin, the piece of dirt my family deemed entirely worthless. They had handed me a weapon disguised as an insult. I kept that little wooden cabin exactly where it belongs. It remains at the very center of my life, standing proudly as the unshakable foundation of a multi-billion-dollar empire. The quiet, insecure archivist was dead and buried. The Titan of Blue Ridge had arrived, and my reign over the logistics world had only just begun.